What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
My parents told me they couldn't spare a penny for my wedding, and they said it with the kind of serious, heavy tone people usually save for bad medical news or a financial collapse. So for a second, I honestly believed something terrible must have happened behind the scenes, something that would make any normal daughter immediately switch into concern mode instead of thinking about centerpieces or catering. I remember sitting there at their kitchen table with my ring still feeling new on my finger, ready to tell them all about how my fiancé and I had started looking at venues and talking about dates. And instead of excitement or even the usual nosy questions about flowers and dresses, I got a long, awkward sigh from my mom, a quick glance between her and my dad, and then the line that felt like a punch in the gut, "Honey, we just can't afford to help you." Not even a little bit. They launched into a whole explanation about rising costs, how everything is so expensive now, how they're just barely keeping up with bills, and how it wouldn't be fair to put themselves into debt for a wedding when the marriage is what matters, not the party. I nodded along, trying to be understanding, but in my head, I was doing the math on their recent vacations and their constant home renovations and realizing none of this was adding up. I told myself to let it go because, fine, maybe they were in a tight spot, and maybe I'd rather have a simple wedding than watch my parents struggle financially. But then, not even 2 months later, I found out they had dropped several $1,000s on an all-inclusive, luxury honeymoon for my brother and his new wife, business-class flights, ocean view suite, private excursions, the works. And they were bragging about it like it was the most generous thing they'd ever done, telling anyone who would listen how proud they were to give him and his bride the start they deserved. The same people who had just told me they couldn't give me a single cent for my wedding were suddenly acting like they were the Rockefellers of family generosity, and when I asked my mom about it in the calmest voice I could manage, she didn't even look embarrassed. She just smiled and said, "Well, you know your brother. He works so hard, and we wanted to do something special for him. And besides, they don't have the same kind of income you and Matt have. You're more independent." I swear she said that like it was some kind of compliment, like my ability to budget my life meant I deserved less from my own family. It wasn't the money itself that cut the deepest, it was the clear, undeniable proof that they had one set of rules for him and another for me, and I had been naive enough to hope that maybe, when it came to something as big as a wedding, they'd treat us equally. I should have known better because it had been like this my whole life. My brother, Mark, was the golden child from the moment he could walk, the one who needed extra help in college, who deserved a new car because his was too old for someone commuting so far, who had my parents stepping in to cover every unexpected bill while I was figuring out how to pay rent and keep the lights on in my first apartment without even a loan of $20 offered. If I ever pointed it out, I was being dramatic or keeping score, so I learned to stop saying anything at all, to just let it wash over me while I built my own life without expecting fairness. But this was different. This was them looking me in the eye and telling me no, and then turning around and doing the exact thing they had just claimed they couldn't possibly do, for the exact reason they'd denied me, because it was a wedding, because it was important, because it was a once-in-a-lifetime event. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, and I didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how much it stung, but in that moment, I felt something click into place in my head. I knew that if I tried to argue with them, they'd find a way to twist it into me being ungrateful or jealous, and honestly, they were so good at that game they'd probably convince even me that I was the problem. So instead, I kept my mouth shut and smiled like I was fine with it, even joked about having a cheap courthouse wedding, and told them not to worry, I'd keep things small and affordable. They seemed relieved, and in that relief, I realized I'd just been handed the perfect opportunity. They were never going to see my wedding the way I wanted them to, as a celebration worth investing in, so I was going to give them something else instead, a complete blackout. No save the dates, no invitations, no phone calls about cake flavors or seating charts. Nothing. If they were going to write me out of my own milestone, then I was going to write them out too, in a way they wouldn't even see coming. I didn't tell Matt right away, but the plan was already forming in my head, and the more I thought about it, the better it sounded. It wouldn't be petty, it wouldn't be loud, and it wouldn't give them a single chance to accuse me of starting drama. It would just be quiet, controlled, mine. And when the day finally came, they'd be the ones realizing they had no role in it, no story to tell about how they helped make it happen, no photos on their mantle to show off. They'd be left with whatever scraps of information I chose to give them, which at that point was leaning toward exactly zero. Looking back now, I think that was the exact moment I decided I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing a single detail about my wedding. When I left my parents' house that day, I knew that anything I said in the heat of the moment would be used later as proof that I was dramatic or ungrateful or whatever label they needed to keep the family story tidy. So I did the one thing they never expect from me, which is to say nothing, to go home, to sit with the anger until it cooled into focus, and then to tell Matt, slowly and carefully, that I didn't want to fight with my parents and I didn't want them involved in my wedding in any way. And if that meant we changed the plan entirely, I could live with that, because I was done performing gratitude for people who only understood love when it came with receipts and public credit. Matt listened the way he always does, not with theatrics or pity, but with quiet questions that forced me to say the part one was afraid to say out loud, which was that I didn't just want a smaller wedding. I wanted a clean break from the cycle where my life milestones turned into family theater, and I wanted to come out the other side having kept something that was fully ours, untouched by their running commentary and their habit of turning my choices into cautionary tales for cousins and neighbors. We sat at our little dining table and did the math that every adult couple in this country ends up doing at some point. The kind where you look at the accounts and the scheduled bills and the vacation days left, and you ask not what would look good on Instagram or make your mother stop gossiping, but what would keep the two of you sane and proud when the day was over. And the answer surprised me in how obvious it felt once I said it, because what I wanted was not a grand event with 700 photos and a complicated seating chart. What I wanted was to stand with the person I chose and make it real without needing a single person's permission. And if that meant getting on a plane with two closest friends and signing the papers where no one from my family could interfere, then maybe that was not rebellious or cold, maybe that was just grown up. Matt didn't flinch. He nodded and said if we did it that way we would actually be saving money for the life we said we wanted, the life where emergencies don't knock us flat, the life where we make decisions because they make sense, not because we are trying to keep up with a brother who gets trophies for showing up. Once we said it out loud, the plan felt simple, and the simplicity was a relief I didn't know my body needed, because cutting out my parents meant cutting out the endless loop of approvals and subtle digs and last-minute suggestions that are really demands dressed up like kindness, and instead it became a short list of tasks we could handle ourselves. Choose a city we both love for reasons that matter to us and not to anyone else. Book a straightforward ceremony with the minimum legal requirements. Ask two friends to witness and keep their mouths shut, and tell no one until it was a done deal. That was the rule I repeated to myself every time I felt the pull to share, because secrecy is a muscle, and in families like mine, that muscle is either flabby from a lifetime of oversharing or it is strong because you learned young that safety sometimes means keeping your joy quiet. I could hear my mother's voice in my head telling relatives that I was undecided about the wedding date and that Matt was dragging his feet, and I realized that as long as I fed the rumor mill even a single crumb, they would keep rewriting my life to fit their favorite story about me, so I stopped feeding it entirely. There were practical steps that made the whole thing feel like a heist pulled off in broad daylight, which probably says more about my family than about weddings, but that is the truth. I got a new email for the travel bookings so nothing popped up on shared devices. I told work I was taking a long weekend for a personal appointment and left it at that. I moved a small chunk of savings through an account my parents never ask about because they still think of me like a confused kid with a piggy bank, and I turned off social media tags because there is always that one friend who thinks a photo is harmless until your aunt texts you to ask why you are hiding. The lies I told were small and boring, which made them effective. I told my mother that Matt and I were focusing on work for a while and not planning anything specific yet. I told my brother I couldn't attend one of his never-ending post-wedding celebrations because I was helping a friend move, and I told myself that none of this was spite, it was strategy, and there is a difference. Of course, there were moments where the old habits tried to pull me back, because it is hard to unlearn the reflex of defending yourself to people who have already decided what they want to believe. And when my mom called one evening to tell me in that syrupy tone that she had found a perfect budget venue I should consider, the kind of place that would give her hours of material to discuss with her friends, I caught myself almost explaining that we were thinking of something else, and then I stopped, and I said thank you, and I let the silence sit there like a closed door she was not invited to open. She pivoted to Mark within seconds, as she always does, telling me about the spa package they bought for his wife and how young couples need support, and even though I felt the old heat of unfairness rise in my chest, I let it pass, because I had finally understood that my power in this moment was not in winning an argument, it was in not offering one at all. While all of this was settling into place, I found myself thinking about the kind of marriage I wanted to start, and it wasn't one where our first year together was spent untangling my parents' feelings or defending our choices at every family dinner. I wanted to start on our terms, with the kind of boundary that does not need a speech or a meltdown to exist, the kind that is clear because your actions make it clear, and as soon as I framed it that way, the guilt I had been carrying melted into something sharper and cleaner, which was resolve. I told Matt that after we got married, we would keep it quiet for a while, not because we were ashamed, but because I wanted the space to enjoy being a wife without immediately having to manage a narrative, and he agreed, adding that if anyone deserved a private win, it was me. That sentence landed like permission I did not know I had been waiting for, and once I had it, I did not look back. So we picked the city, we booked the date, we told our two friends, and we wrote the plan down to the hour so there would be no texting slip-ups and no accidental tags and no receipts floating into the wrong hands, and I felt something I had not felt in a long time, which was control over my own life event, unbothered by other people's expectations and free from the little jabs that had taught me to brace for disappointment. I set my phone to Do Not Disturb. I packed the folder with the paperwork, and I looked at Matt across our small, ordinary table with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that the next choice is going to change everything and that no one who tried to minimize her will get to claim a piece of it. And that is how the invitations ended up being the easiest part of the entire wedding, because they never existed, not a single one, not a whisper, not a trace. Which was exactly how I wanted it as we booked the tickets for a ceremony my family would not see coming by a mile. The morning we flew out felt strangely calm because there is a very specific kind of relief that comes when you stop asking for permission and simply move forward, and while I am not someone who enjoys sneaking around, I will admit that there was something deeply satisfying about moving through the airport with a carry-on that held a simple outfit, the documents we needed, and a promise we had chosen to keep to ourselves. Because unlike every family milestone that had turned into a group project with scorecards and rankings, this one belonged to us from start to finish, and I could feel my shoulders drop with every step that took me farther from the noise and closer to the life I was building with Matt. We landed, checked in, sent a single text to our two friends who were already there because they had taken an earlier flight, and then put our phones away like grown adults who understand that privacy is not the same as secrecy when the point is to protect your peace rather than hide shame. And when we met them in the lobby, the conversation was not about aesthetics or viral photos. It was about whether we were ready to do this without a cheering section, and whether we felt good about the boundary we were drawing. And when both of us said yes at the same time, I knew this was the correct path, even if some people would insist it was cold or petty. The ceremony itself was as straightforward as it gets because the goal was not a performance. The goal was a commitment, and if I am being honest, the quietness gave me exactly what I could never have had at a big family event, which was space to think about the choice I was making rather than about centerpieces or who would be offended by sitting near whom. And while that might sound unromantic to someone who loves the show of it all, I am telling you that there was nothing unromantic about standing there with Matt and saying words that meant something to us without an audience waiting to judge how heartfelt our expressions looked. And when I signed my name on the license, I felt an anchored certainty that I wish I could bottle for every young woman who has been trained to measure her joy against her family's approval. Afterward, we walked to a small office to file the paperwork, thanked the two friends who witnessed, shared a quick meal that tasted better for not being a negotiation, and then went back to the hotel where we sat on the bed and talked about the next part, which was the more delicate one, because we were not just married, we were married in silence, and silence needs a plan. The plan was boring by design because boring lasts, so we turned off location services on anything that could betray us. We agreed to avoid posting anything that could be misinterpreted. And we scheduled a couple of harmless photos from earlier months to auto-post so that any relative with too much time and an appetite for drama would find nothing to latch onto. And if you think that sounds paranoid, you have not met my family's group chat on a slow weekend. I never imagined I would start my marriage with a communication strategy, but this was less about hiding and more about building a wall high enough to protect the first days of our life together from people who would have turned them into a referendum on my choices. And as soon as I accepted that, I stopped apologizing in my head for not looping in people who had proven over and over that they confuse access with love. There was a moment, late that first night, when my phone lit up with a message from my mom asking if I had time to talk, because she had a few ideas for venues that won't break the bank. And I sat there looking at the screen and thinking about how every conversation with her circles back to control, and I knew that if I answered, I would end up saying something I couldn't take back, so I let it sit. And in the morning, I replied with a thank you and a line about being swamped with work for a while, which she accepted because she prefers stories that let her be the planner and me be the one who needs help, and if playing along for a little longer meant safeguarding what we had just done, then that was a trade I was willing to make. It is funny how quickly people settle into the version of you that serves their narrative, because within days my parents had decided I was taking my time and keeping expectations realistic, which sounded thoughtful on the surface and felt like a dismissal underneath. And I realized that my silence was giving them a sense of comfort I could use later, which was the point, because this was not only a wedding, it was the first step in a long-term correction. When we flew home, we did not carry souvenirs or make a scene. We went back to our apartment, put the license in the fireproof folder with the other important papers, and took a breath. And then we did the day-to-day things that make a marriage real long after the photos are deleted, like sharing the grocery list and merging a couple of bills and deciding how to handle holidays now that the default options would not work for us anymore. And while that might sound small, it felt big in all the right ways because none of it depended on my mother's calendar or my brother's habit of center staging every room he enters. A week later, I saw Mark at a casual family thing I could not reasonably skip without raising flags, and he made a crack about how I should lock down a date before Matt gets bored, and the old me would have fired back or left early. But this new version of me just smiled in that way people use when they are hiding something worth protecting, and I asked about his trip and let him talk until he ran out of adjectives, and when my mother swooped in to show me a brochure for a venue she liked, I thanked her and tucked it away like someone who might actually consider it, because I understood that keeping the peace now would make the disruption later that much more powerful. The small revenge at the end of that month was not loud, but it was clean and it was mine. I sent a group text to a handful of relatives who loved to gossip and said that Matt and I had decided to slow down planning because work was busy and we wanted to be smart about money, which I knew would get repeated to my parents in the exact tone of approval they crave, and it did, because within hours my mom called to say she was proud of me for being practical, and for once I let her have it, not because I needed her praise, but because I wanted her to feel certain, to be absolutely comfortable in the version of events that erased any urgency from my relationship, so that when the truth finally came out, it would land like a dropped piano instead of a soft note. By the time the first year passed, they had moved from asking when the wedding might be to wondering if it would happen at all. And I could hear the shift in my mother's voice when she told a cousin that maybe Matt and I had taken a break, and I remember thinking, keep going, build your little story brick by brick, because the higher you build it, the harder it will fall when I decide it is time to walk through the door with my husband and let the silence do the talking. The first year passed in a way that would sound boring to anyone who needs a loud storyline to feel alive, but to me it felt like oxygen, because the days were finally about building a life with my husband instead of managing my mother's opinions. And that looked like setting up joint accounts with practical rules we actually stuck to, learning how to split chores without turning every conversation into a scoreboard, figuring out how to handle holidays so we did not spend every long weekend being pulled across town by guilt, and teaching ourselves to treat the marriage like something private and steady rather than a product for family consumption, which turned out to be its own kind of training because privacy is not natural when you grew up with a parent who narrates your life for sport. There were close calls that would have blown the secret if I had been careless, like the afternoon a coworker ran into me at the grocery store while I was with my husband and cheerfully asked how married life was going, which would have been fine in any normal world. Except that a neighbor of my parents was 2 aisles over, and the way she startled at the word married told me that if she put two and two together, the story would move faster than a group chat on a boring Sunday. So I laughed and made a joke about married to the job, and we moved along. And later that night, I realized how much mental energy goes into keeping something precious from people who like to turn it into a spectacle. And I decided again that it was worth it. My mother, who cannot stand a vacuum of information, filled it the way she always does, with confident guesses said like facts. So while I was learning how to balance a budget with another person and deciding how to build a future that was not just an upgraded version of my childhood home, she was telling relatives that Matt and I were taking space, that I was reevaluating, that it might be for the best because we were very different, which is a line she uses when she needs to make someone else's boundaries sound like maturity on her part, and I let her talk because every assumption she made now would become an accidental confession later when she discovered the truth. Mark stayed on brand as well, sliding smart remarks into conversations like a kid flicking rubber bands in class, asking if I had considered that maybe I was not easy to plan around, implying that Matt was probably over it, and suggesting that I should lock things down before I missed my chance. And I remember watching him gloat through another story about the fancy thing my parents had paid for and realizing that for the first time in years, I did not feel the old ache of comparison. I felt distance, the good kind, the kind that says not my circus, not my problem. We had agreed not to poke the bear unless the bear wandered onto our porch, and for months it did not, because my silence let my mother settle into her favorite version of events, where she is the concerned narrator, and I am the daughter who needs guidance. But then, right around their wedding anniversary, she called with her chirpiest voice and asked if I could chip in for a surprise second honeymoon for Mark and his wife, because they were stressed and deserved a reset, and I could hear her smiling through the phone as if this was not exactly the kind of request that would dig under my skin and drag out the oldest, ugliest resentment, and I almost did the polite thing where you say you will think about it. But a switch flipped and I realized this was one of those rare moments where repeating a sentence verbatim is not petty, it is justice, so I took a breath and said, as evenly as I could, that I was sorry, but I could not spare a penny. The silence that followed was not long in terms of seconds, but it was long in terms of history, because I knew she heard what I was saying beneath the words, and I knew she remembered exactly when she had said that to me. And when she stammered something about how this was different because Mark and his wife had been through a lot, I added that Matt and I had been through a lot too and had managed by being practical, and I thanked her for understanding. I hung up feeling a kind of clean satisfaction I had not felt since the day I decided to elope, because it was not a tantrum, it was a mirror, and sometimes the best revenge is letting someone see their favorite excuse held up to their own needs. From that day on, the tone of our interactions shifted in a way only I would have noticed, because my mother does not admit defeat, she just changes tactics, so the pitying comments about how some people are meant to be single longer turned into subtle digs about me being overly independent, and the faux concern about my relationship status turned into a campaign to set me up with the son of a friend, which was almost impressive in its refusal to accept the reality right in front of her, and I reacted by refusing the bait with the kind of soft yes that mean no, a skill I picked up after a childhood of learning that direct no's were treated like challenges. Meanwhile, my husband and I kept building, not loudly, not on purpose to make a point, but in the quiet way real lives are built when you are not playing to the cheap seats, and that looked like reworking our budget so we could tuck away a little more each month. Talking through future plans with a level of honesty that would have made my teenage self roll her eyes, and choosing which invitations we would accept and which we would decline without writing a memo about it, because I am done explaining my boundaries to people who only hear an invitation to negotiate. There were moments I almost broke the silence, because any normal person wants to share good news with family. Like the day our lease renewal came with favorable terms because the landlord liked us, and I wanted to tell my dad that responsible people sometimes get rewarded in quiet ways. Or the morning I got a promotion and wanted to bring my mom coffee and say, "Look, I am not lost, I am not flailing, I am doing fine." But the memory of that kitchen table conversation kept me steady, and I saved the story for people who had earned proximity by showing up without strings, and you would be amazed how quickly you find your chosen family once you stop performing for your original one. When extended relatives asked for updates, I kept it bland and pleasant, and when a cousin pressed me at a barbecue about whether Matt and I were still together, I smiled and said we were taking care of ourselves and focusing on what mattered, which is true even when people think it is a dodge. And later she texted me that my mother had told her I was healing from a rough breakup, and I realized the lie had grown legs and was now running laps, which would have made me furious once upon a time, but now it just made me patient, because the longer the myth stretched, the more dramatic the snapback would be. The second small revenge, the one that carried me through the last stretch of silence before everything changed, was almost nothing, and yet it felt like everything, when my parents asked if I could host Thanksgiving because Mark's place was too small. I told them we would not be available and that they should celebrate without worrying about us, and when my mother tried to guilt me with a speech about family traditions, I reminded her very calmly that grown children are allowed to build their own, and then I logged off the call and booked a weekend away with my husband where we ate what we wanted, talked about what we wanted, and did not spend the evening cleaning up after people who never lifted a finger. And if you think that is not revenge, you have never been the default daughter whose labor keeps everyone comfortable. Reclaiming your time is not just a boundary, it is a declaration, and the absence sends a message louder than any dramatic confrontation. By the time the family reunion invite rolled around, I had gone from dreading those events to seeing them as a stage I could choose to walk onto when the timing served me, and when I RSVP'd yes for two with no explanation, I felt the quiet click of a plan locking into place. Because I did not have to orchestrate the finale. My mother had done it for me with every false update, every pitying aside, every boast about how she was guiding me through a hard season, and all I had to do now was arrive at the exact moment. Her story reached its peak and introduced my husband like the truth we had been holding steady all along. I walked into the reunion a little late on purpose, because I know my family's rhythm, and I knew that by the second hour the stories would swell to their most dramatic version, and sure enough, before I even reached the doorway to the backyard, I heard my mother's voice carrying over the low buzz of conversation as she told a cluster of relatives that it had been a hard season for me, that Matt and I had parted ways, that I was focusing on myself and taking time to heal, and I stood there long enough to feel the familiar mix of anger and disbelief rise in my chest before it hardened into calm, the kind of calm you get when the ending is already written and all that is left is to turn the page. I stepped forward, reached for my husband's hand, and walked straight into the middle of her sentence, and without raising my voice or putting on a show I said, as plainly as I could, that there must be a misunderstanding, because I would like everyone to meet my husband. And I said his full name the way you do when the truth needs to hit the room with no wiggle room left, and then I held his hand up with mine so the simple bands were visible, and I watched the story she had been telling slide right off her face. Silence is not common in my family, but a clean reveal will do it, and what followed was the longest few breaths I have ever seen a group of people take. Because you could watch the little machines of their minds trying to reorganize 2 years of gossip into some version that did not make them look foolish, and right in that pause I felt an old weight roll off my shoulders. Because for once I was not scrambling to explain or defend, I was not playing the defendant in a court that never gives verdicts. I was simply standing next to my reality and letting it be undeniable. My mother tried first, because she always does, reaching for a chuckle that sounded like a hiccup and saying there must have been a miscommunication, that she never said we had broken up, that she had only said we were taking space. And I smiled, the kind of smile you use when you are about to put something heavy down on a table and walk away from it for good. And I told her I understood how stories can get away from people, especially when they are filling in blanks that do not belong to them, and that I was happy to clear it up right now for anyone who might still be confused. I turned to the group, thanked them for caring, and said that Matt and I had been married for 2 years, that we were doing well, and that the reason they had not been part of it was simple and uninteresting. We chose privacy in the face of a pattern that had made our milestones feel like public property. There were questions, of course there were, and I answered only the ones that were asked with genuine curiosity rather than a need to claw back control, because if there is one lesson I am taking from this whole thing, it is that you do not owe background to people who only want ammunition. A couple of aunts hugged me and whispered that they were happy for me even if they did not understand the secrecy. A cousin asked if we had a photo from the day, and I showed her one quick picture, and then slid my phone away. And in the corner of my eye I saw Mark with his arms crossed and his mouth tilted, getting ready for a jab that would land like a gnat and call itself a punch. And when he finally said that keeping a marriage secret sounded childish, I looked at him the way you look at a loud television and told him that calling anything childish from the top of a pile of gifts other people bought you is a choice, and that if he was upset about not having inside information, he should take it up with the part of himself that treats other people's lives like a hobby. He sputtered and tried to laugh it off, but the room had shifted by then, because nothing pops a balloon like a straight pin. My mother rallied with the move she has always relied on, which is to recast herself as the wounded party and to act like my decision had been a personal attack on her, asking why I would shut out my own family, why I would deny her the joy of helping her daughter on a special day. And I knew we had reached the part of the show where the old me might have softened or apologized to keep the peace, so I did the thing that mattered most to me in that moment, which was to answer her with the exact sentence that started all of this, and to do it without venom, only memory. I told her I had taken her guidance to heart when she told me she could not spare a penny for my wedding, and that I had respected that boundary completely, and that, in return, I had drawn my own boundary and respected it just as fully, and if she did not like how that felt, then maybe she had learned something today about what it is to be on the other side of a decision you did not make. There was a murmur then, the low kind that means people are realizing the story has a deeper history than they were told, and I let it sit, because you do not need to narrate a wake-up call, you just need to ring it once. The satisfaction of the moment was not in humiliation, though I will not pretend there was not a spark of pleasure in watching the math happen on a few faces. It was in reclaiming my own adulthood with a clarity that did not require cruelty. And that is why the small revenge I delivered next felt so clean. I raised my glass, thanked everyone for coming, and said that since there seemed to be confusion, I would make a little announcement to keep things tidy, which was that Matt and I would be holding a vow renewal next year, not a spectacle, not a registry, and certainly not a fundraiser, but a simple celebration for people who can show up without rewriting our choices, and that if anyone felt tempted to tell the story for us, they could save their energy because invitations would go out only to those who have shown they can keep their mouths shut until it is their business. A few people laughed, the relieved kind of laugh you hear when someone finally says the quiet part out loud, and a few looked at their shoes, and my mother said nothing, which, in my world, is what victory sounds like. We did not stay long because the point was never to linger over the wreckage. The point was to drop the truth in exactly the right place and let it do its work. So we made the rounds, accepted the congratulations that felt sincere, and then we left before anyone could regroup into a new angle. And as we walked to the car, my husband asked how I felt, and I told him that I felt like I had finally stepped out of a play I never auditioned for, and that the quiet in my head was worth every hard minute it took to get here. There will be fallout, there always is, and I am not naive about that, but I also know that the center of gravity is moved and that my mother can keep telling stories if she wants, only now everyone has seen the ending with their own eyes. And the ending is simple. I did not scream, I did not beg, I did not compete. I just changed the lock on the door to my life and handed out keys to the people who had earned them, and the rest can call from the porch if they have something kind to say. If you want to know whether it was too far, I will tell you that it was exactly far enough, because I did not burn the bridge. I just stopped building it for people who never plan to meet me halfway. And if that leaves a question hanging in the air about what happens at the vow renewal and who shows up, that is fine by me, because the real point has already landed. They tried to write my story without me, and I turned the page myself.